It's been more than 75 years since World War II ended, but on the screen, the fight goes on and on and on. It's no secret that American viewers love war movies, but World War II stands apart from the rest among all the military conflicts. It seems to be the one war that filmmakers and audiences alike are always ready to revisit. Like most countries, the United States of America was born out of war. Our history is often defined by the battles we fight, and we frequently talk about different time periods in relation to the wars they're closest to. Post-World War I, during the Vietnam War, etc. We've been in wars or involved in military conflicts almost constantly, even now. Wars are always a tragic thing. There is really no such thing as a good war. And as John Steinbeck described it, all war is a symptom of man's failure as a thinking animal. The loss of human life is always tragic, and by design, wars can't happen or end without death. Sadly, so many of those killed are soldiers so young they've barely had the chance to really experience life. So many of them died and will continue to die for what is often nothing but abstract, stubborn ideals, or even worse, complete fabrications that hide the real motivations. Many soldiers are sent to their deaths to defend a country they've barely had the chance to see outside their small hometowns. But why does World War II stand out among all wars? It was by no means the only large-scale war the US was involved in. World War I was dubbed the war to end all wars, and it was one of the most significant conflicts in history. It had wide-ranging and long-lasting impacts on the world, and other wars lasted longer than World War II. The attacks on 9/11 happened not only on mainland American soil, but at one of our major cities. Almost 3,000 people were killed, over 6,000 were injured, and it cost billions of dollars worth of damage. 9/11 had a huge and long-lasting impact on this country. And yet, unlike Pearl Harbor, the Japanese attack that resulted in the US entering World War II, there are no Hollywood movies that glorify the events. The films that do deal with 9/11 are usually somber, often controversial, and don't really attract audiences. Needless to say, there is no Michael Bay directed 9/11 meets Titanic summer blockbuster. But there's something different about World War II. There's no doubt that it was a vast war and that its impact is still felt today. But why is it so popular with Hollywood and audiences? While other wars make us want to look away, moviegoers often embrace World War II movies. A lot of that has to do with the war itself. World War II was the last war to really unite us as a country. Since then, just about every military conflict and war the US has been involved in inspired as much protest as support. But in World War II, there was a clear delineation between the good guys and the bad guys. The term good versus evil was something that was easily applied, and the impact of the war on the US dramatically impacts how we look back on it. The fact that most of the fighting happened away from us plays a pivotal role in how we remember World War II and why many refer to it as a good war. It also helped bring the nation out of the Great Depression. But during the war, soldiers had to live with the possibility that they might never come home again. Death was a constant presence, and because of this, many came home with a new appreciation for life. They wasted no time getting married and starting families. This led to what is often referred to as the baby boom. These soldiers missed out on so much because of the war, and they were eager to make up for the lost time. They bought homes and went to college, among other things. They've often been referred to as the greatest generation, not only because it helped win the war, but because it helped the country's economy reach new heights in the late 40s and 50s. Having defeated the Axis powers, there was a general sense of optimism in the country. There was a belief that there was nothing Americans couldn't do, and the economy thrived as well. In the eyes of the world, America emerged as a leader and global superpower. It was estimated that during the war, over 60 million people were killed, or about 3% of the 1940 world population. Still, America's losses were minor in comparison to the other allies and the Axis powers. And unlike most of Europe, the US didn't need any rebuilding and was the only nation with the atomic bomb. The global economy suffered heavily from the war, but the nations involved were impacted very differently. In stark contrast to many of the other countries, the US emerged with a very healthy economy. By 1950, its gross domestic product per person was much higher than the other nations involved in the war. Between 1945 and 1949, the United States was the most powerful nation in the world, and its dominance was unlike any other seen in history before. That's what World War II did for America. Another big reason why World War II is a war we have no problem revisiting is that, as Stephen Ambrose, one of America's most respected historians, explains it, World War II gave birth to the American spirit. Only 20 years had passed since World War I was dubbed the war to end all wars. But that certainly didn't turn out to be the case. And because of that, many people believed that the US should stay out of the war. As Stephen Ambrose pointed out, about 40% of the American people were against entering the war. That is until December 7th, 1941. But after Pearl Harbor, public opinion about the war changed drastically. December 8th, 1941 had more enlistments than any other day in American history. Because the war was no longer something happening overseas that could be ignored, Americans faced a common enemy, and suddenly, local problems didn't seem so important. Stephen Ambrose explained that World War II strengthened us as a country. We were much more committed to the idea of the country rather than the region. People didn't speak of themselves anymore as being, well, I'm a rebel, I'm from Mississippi, I'm a Yankee, I'm from Wisconsin. It was, I'm an American. That would always spring first to their lips. Another reason why World War II inspires so many movies is the simple fact that Hollywood loves to tell large stories with big themes and in broad strokes. And the sheer scope of the war allows for that. The war can be used to tell stories about the triumph of the human spirit that movies like The King's Speech, directed by Tom Hooper, embody. The atrocities of World War II are so inhumane and shocking that they allow filmmakers to show the darker side of humanity in a way that screams serious film without exaggerating or resorting to sensationalism. And the scale of human suffering works well with what is often known as prestige storytelling. There is an almost unanimous agreement about the war. Unfortunately, this invites reductive storytelling that avoids nuance in favor of simple truths. Movies like Saving Private Ryan propagate the belief and branding of World War II as the good war. That's not to say that Saving Private Ryan isn't an incredibly well done film. Most people, myself included, would agree that its many merits outweigh any of its flaws. But it and many other World War II movies depict American involvement as perhaps more crucial than it really was. They portray Americans as the heroes that stepped in and saved the day in a way that is very appealing to American audiences and critics alike. Most people talk about Saving Private Ryan's realism, but overlook the fact that it's patriotic in such an uncritical way that the movie borders on propaganda. And if the movie were about any other war, more people would have called it out for the jingoism it at times resembles. In fact, audiences are so used to seeing World War II on the big screen that few people even think twice about the fact that *Inglourious Basterds*, directed by Quentin Tarantino, essentially turned one of the most heinous events in human history into a comedy. Again, that's not a comment on the quality of the film, but the audience's reaction is very telling. It shows that audiences have become, if not desensitized, at least comfortable enough with World War II that it can be used as entertainment. But the fact that World War II is a war everyone can agree on gives these movies a bit of a pass. filmmakers can approach a project with a sort of safety net that comes from knowing that these movies are usually viewed through a less critical lens than movies about other wars.